It's the week ending Friday the 12th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the assassination of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk, international condemnation following Israel's targeting of Hamas in Qatar, and Gary Lineker winning Best TV Presenter at the National TV Awards, breaking Ant & Dec's 23-year winning streak. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Jamie, Timson and Harriet Marsden, nearly the full set, but sitting in for Felicity this week. It is my co-host from Today in History with the Retrospectors, Rebecca Messina. Folks, there was also the small matter of a government reshuffle this week, and hot off the press, we're due a new American ambassador as well at the time of recording. If you were all putting yourself forward for a cabinet position, what would take your fancy?
I've got to say Foreign Secretary. I genuinely think I would offend fewer people than Boris Johnson did in that role.
I've seen your suit game as well, and I think you could bring some real power to those photo shoots, which is half the battle.
Thank you.
Jamie, you've served in the government in a way.
Yes, I definitely wouldn't choose Transport Secretary, that's for sure. I think maybe like DCMS or something, one of the ones where you get to go and like glad hand with entertainment, schmooze some people like that.
Yeah. Get invited to the Spectator Summer Party. Yeah.
Rebecca.
Exactly. Every government minister's dream.
I'm a rules girl, so I'd probably have to say Justice Ministry.
Ooh.
Cross me at your peril.
Can see you in the wig and everything. Rebecca, okay, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week a ghost of the past came back to haunt the US military.
This woman was forced into the sex trade to service U.S. soldiers during and after the Korean War. Myung-soo was 15 years old at the time. For $5 to $10 per soldier, she endured a lifetime of shame. But now she's demanding accountability from the U.S. military and the South Korean government for their complicity in the sex trade.
A video from Al Jazeera on YouTube called How Korea's Sex Trade Was Built for US Soldiers. Rebecca, what's the story?
So on Monday at a press conference in Seoul, it was announced that a group of 117 women has filed a lawsuit against the US government via the South Korean government. It's a bit complicated, over their experience as sex workers in state-sanctioned brothels servicing US troops from the 50s into the 80s and in some forms even into the early 2000s as well. The issue has already been before the courts in South Korea in 2022. The country's Supreme Court ruled that the women were entitled to compensation from the South Korean government specifically, which was about £2,500 each. The current lawsuit is about getting recognition and acknowledgement and also compensation from the US military. The suit has been filed in Seoul because South Korea technically, like any cases made against the US military for crimes allegedly committed on South Korean soil have to go through the South Korean legal system. But they are now seeking 10 million won each, which is about £5,300. So again, not stacks of money, but a lot of it is about acknowledgement.
State-sanctioned brothels. Just talk us through what happened.
Yeah, so not only, it's very common all over the world, obviously, for there to be brothels and sex workers around military installations. But in this case, there was it wasn't just a case of local authorities turning a blind eye to it. It was actively encouraged. The reason for that being that South Korea both wanted to maintain good relations with the US in the aftermath of the Korean War, but also the economy was extremely frail at the time, and the sex trade was seen as a way of getting valuable dollars into the economy. So officials urged the women to basically work as hard as possible in order to put dollars into the economy. It was sort of met with an ambivalent attitude in South Korean society at the time. A contemporary newspaper called the so-called comfort women a cancer-like necessary evil, frontline warriors in winning dollars. So there was this sense of shame around them that's a bit, we can get into this a bit more later, but dissimilar to what happened with the more well-known comfort women who were forced to serve Japanese occupiers. This was almost a voluntary tribute from the South Korean government to the American allies.
And when you say dollars into the economy, So they were paid for their sex work, but they didn't spend it themselves, or they did, and that's how it got into the economy, or it was taken from them?
So it was taken from them and it went to their pimps. It wasn't passed back directly to the government, but obviously the pimps were then spending the money in the economy, and so the dollars were going into circulation that way. The women themselves received very little, and in many cases nothing, and they had basically no control over their lives. Some of them were coerced or tricked into brothels in the first place. Some of them had been hired as barmaids in nightclubs. Some of them were just literally abducted off the street. Many of them were teenagers. And even those who did enter willingly say they had no control over, they were forced to work long hours. They were subjected to abuse and violence from their clients. And they were forced to undergo, as was mentioned in the video, these very invasive STD testing and treatment programs without consent, which involved basically they would be inspected, including by US military authorities. We can talk more about this, but the US was actively participating in this. They would be forced to show their cards showing that they had tested clean for sexually transmitted diseases. And if they couldn't produce that and they were found to have an STD, they were basically shut up and unable to leave these treatment facilities until they had been cured, which involved being subjected to large amounts of penicillin. And some women also did die from penicillin shock.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, I think, Harriet, to underline the conditions that these women were being kept in, because in some senses in the 21st century, when you hear about the state endorsing or supporting sex work, you might think of that as a progressive policy, like better than it being in the black market, better that people know where they are, better that their tax is collected. It wasn't like that.
I think it would be more accurate to describe these women as sex slaves, because there's such an enormous power disparity between US servicemen, military personnel supported by your own government, supported by the South Korean government, and these women, most of whom were coerced or exploited or even just, kidnapped into this effectively sexual slavery. And the conditions are the victim statements are so horrific, talking about them being locked in rooms and being forcibly injected with penicillin, where the shots made their legs give out, that they were dragged to the soldiers and abused every night. I think it's also fair to say that there's two rounds of victimization. You've got the first wave where the women were sold and abused and effectively tortured, and then you have this secondary victimization over the decades where they might have been socially stigmatized, excluded from their communities and families. That's often what we see in victims of sexual exploitation, is that they're then ostracized, or they suffer from diseases or health complications all their lives, and their stories are ignored or kind of hushed up. It was only in 2022 that South Korea's court ruled that the government had established and managed these brothels. So it's such a long time that these victims have had to be then kind of re-victimizing themselves, sharing these stories over and over again, and kind of using their trauma to try and get the compensation and the acknowledgement that they deserve.
And I guess because it went on so long, for many decades after the Korean War, there's sort of a sense amongst that generation of everybody, I was about to say generation of women, but men too, of just like, oh yeah, well that happened. We know that happened and we don't talk about it. And it's almost like it takes a younger generation to come along and say, we did what?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think there were obviously early discussions about it, but you have to remember that in the Cold War, South Korea's survival kind of heavily depended on US military presence, and kind of publicly naming and shaming the US military would have risked kind of political backlash. So I think within society, there was a kind of a hush-hush mantra that meant that it wasn't really investigated, and the victims were marginalized, women getting older, suffering kind of stigma and shame. And basically it wasn't until kind of society's thoughts about this stuff moved on a bit, and it wasn't until the 1980s that they got kind of increased media attention, and the Korean Council reframed the comfort woman issue as a human rights advocacy movement. I mean, it's partially also the movement, it seems, from what I've read, was about educating the public as much as restoring the dignity of the victims, was basically explaining to younger generations of South Koreans exactly what these crimes that happened occurred, and how it was kind of accepted by the government.
Yeah, and I guess, Rebecca, as well, that's a shift too, isn't it, in terms of who's broken the law. Prostitution's illegal. So I guess for decades, people's thoughts on this were, well, ergo, the prostitutes broke the law by practicing prostitution. Whereas now the opinion is, no, the government itself broke its own laws by pushing them into it.
Yeah, I mean, South Korea has prostitution has always been legal in South Korea. It was illegal then, it's legal now. And of course, the US military on paper is against its personnel patronizing sex workers. But on the ground, I mean, it is incredible. The US military authorities and local government officials would get together and they would organize English classes for these women. They would organize etiquette and culture classes to educate them more about interacting with Americans. You know, the US military would go into nightclubs and bars and it would ask to see the test cards to prove that women who were applying the sex trade in there had been tested recently. So yeah, the US military were not just turning a blind eye, they were actively involved. They actually also had files containing the details and photos of all of the registered prostitutes, as they were known at the time, so that servicemen who became infected with an STD could pick out the woman that they believed had given them the illness. And so those women then who tested positive were, as we've talked about previously, isolated in these closed medical facilities until they were deemed cured. So there really was an active and relatively open participation. I think the US military at the time, the idea was that it was better to be proactive rather than pretend that it wasn't happening. Obviously, you don't want soldiers coming down in large numbers with venereal disease, which is true in one sense, but obviously the women were the ones who ended up paying the price for this incredibly sophisticated and very regimented sex trade.
What's the US position on it now, Harriet? I mean, we're talking about it partly because it's being underreported. There's not that much out there to see what they think, is there?
There isn't, but what is interesting is that what a lot of people might not know is that the US military position on their service people using prostitutes is actually relatively new. For decades and decades, the fact that US servicemen would use prostitutes around bases in places like South Korea and Japan and Vietnam was absolutely kind of known about and sort of quietly tolerated. But in 2002, there were reports that US peacekeepers and military contractors were implicated in the sex trafficking networks in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 90s. And that kind of put a spotlight on the link between the military deployment and prostitution and illegal trafficking. So that's when George Bush declared a zero tolerance policy on trafficking for US military personnel abroad. And then came the rule in 2006, which banned US service members from soliciting or using prostitutes in places where they were deployed, even if it was legal in the countries where they were. But the only reason that happened really was that they stopped framing it as an issue around use of sex workers and sort of framed it as like a national security issue, basically not wanting their service members implicated in these trafficking rings. So we shouldn't make the mistake of talking about this as if it's something that is confined to the past. The US still stations nearly 30,000 troops in South Korea to help protect it from North Korea, and stations troops all over the world and military contractors, as does the UK. And service members are often implicated in the use of prostitutes and in sexual assault, like significantly more so than the civilian population.
And also, I mean, the British Army, an investigation last month found some soldiers stationed at a controversial base in Kenya continued to use sex workers despite being banned from doing so. And the ban was put in place in 2022 by the UK Ministry of Defence, a kind of blanket ban for its forces using sex workers abroad as part of an effort to curb sexual exploitation and abuse. But it followed the death of a local Kenyan, Agnes Wanjiru, who was allegedly killed by a British soldier who was stationed at the base. This is something that continues into the present day. Obviously, the investigation the information was released last month showed that soldiers are still using sex workers despite being banned. In that situation, you have to ask yourself, what legal protections exist for local people, especially women in these days. And it won't surprise anyone to know that a lot of this stuff is obviously hushed up by the military. But how long can we continue to say that this is okay as we move further and further into, the 21st century?
Well, I suppose one of the things that might help that, Jamie, is a verdict of some kind. What do you think justice would look like here? What do these women want?
Yeah, it's actually really kind of slightly up in the air. Holding the US military directly liable in a South Korean court obviously raises issues of sovereign immunity, international law, and whether even the US courts would accept claims like that. It's far from guaranteed that the US will be held legally accountable, despite the fact that obviously the lawsuit names both Seoul and Washington, so they are going after both. Even if compensation is awarded, many of the survivors have already said that an official apology from the US is what they're looking for. They're not just looking for money, but recognition of wrongdoing. And that's symbolic, but potentially would open the US military up to a lot of criticism in lots of different areas. So they might be unlikely to do that. A successful case obviously could set precedent for other similar cases around the world. And it could influence, how international law treats things like state complicity and military responsibility. I guess it's about really worrying about the kind of erasure of the knowledge about this. And part of the reason why I think it's a great story that we've brought today is because of how underreported it is, and how, particularly in comparison to what Rebecca was saying about Japan and the comfort women, this is an example of something that has been kind of gone under the radar. So hopefully something like this, a court case like this, however it ends, will give a bit more, I guess, knowledge and awareness and a spotlight on this practice and for the victims involved.
I suppose as well, Rebecca, it's not a story that makes Korea look good, 40 years ago, but it sort of kind of speaks well to Korea now, to South Korea now that this is in court and that it is being spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, the existence of these women sits uncomfortably for South Korea, because the more notorious use of comfort women by the Japanese, that fits in perfectly. It can be wielded as a weapon towards Korea's former colonial rulers, with whom South Korea has historically had a hostile relationship. But the US is a key South Korean ally and always has been. So this case both tarnishes the glossy sheen of that alliance, but also gives Japan space to say, well, they did it too, because Korea has come down on Japan several times. I'd say probably motivated by politics rather than a sense of justice for the victims. But they can't do the same with the US. The US comfort women don't fit into South Korea's narrative about its own history. The idea that the Japanese colonized them and then later brutalized them during the war, and then the US came along and helped them achieve independence and prosperity. And of course, they still represent South Korea's strongest ally on the world stage. And the threat from North Korea is by no means absent, and there's still a widespread sort of public ambivalence to the story. It's certainly their voices are being heard now, but I think their story can't be wielded as a political weapon in the same way that the women exploited by Japanese personnel during World War II can. So it's never going to achieve that same level of prominence.
Okay. Up next, what are the odds on a tax increase on horse betting? That's after this. Jamie, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, all bets were off when it came to the GGs.
It's a struggle, especially in the smaller yards. We're really sort of noticing the hit. I mean, the owners, they're coming to us every day and saying, why are we committing to this? Why are we paying this money every month to keep our horses in training? And there's nothing coming back to them.
Sarah Guest, yard manager at John O'Shea Racing, speaking to Sky News on Tuesday. Jamie, what's the story?
Yes, this week, Wednesday. Does that work? Yeah. This Wednesday that just happened.
Yes.
Everyone listening will remember.
We know how the 7-day structure works. Yeah.
Yeah. It was the Wednesday that you've just had. There was no British horse racing. Meetings at Carlisle, Kempton and Lingfield were cancelled, and as well as others around the country, as jockeys, trainers, racecourses and bookmakers united in protest at, well, it's actually, to be honest, it's basically just the fact that the Treasury are considering raising the tax on horse racing. This hasn't even happened yet, but they went on strike. It's the first time that British horse racing has ever gone on strike. There was some reportage about it, but it was a big deal, and I think does highlight quite how culturally important British horse racing is, given the effect that it had and the number of MPs that were asked about it. To explain, basically, at the moment, bets from horse racing, it's taxed at 15%, which is lower than other forms of gambling, which is roughly around 21%. The Treasury is considering, because as we know, we're at a time when the Treasury needs some money, is considering basically harmonising what it calls remote gambling duties. So all betting would be around 21%. This has obviously upset the bookmakers, but it's also upset those involved in horse racing. And now that's because basically bookies fund a lot of horse racing. One, through this thing called the British Horse Racing Levy, which is basically a tax on the profits of bookmakers with regards to horse racing that then goes back into the sport. And it was introduced in 1961 because you were basically in 1961 allowed to bet and not attend horse racing. Previous to that, you had to be at the event in order to bet.
Yeah.
But now you're allowed, obviously, as we know, we can bet from wherever we are in the UK on horse racing.
Well, that's the importance of the word remote in the proposed legislation, though, isn't it? It doesn't actually affect, as I understand it, still traditional bookmakers. Because that's where your natural sympathy might be, fair enough, if you're standing there by the horse track and the government want to take more tax off you for the first time in decades. But it doesn't affect those guys. It's just for people in gambling shops and online. Yeah,
exactly. But they don't have to pay. Your bookmakers at the events don't have to pay any tax at all, which I didn't realise.
Wow.
So until reading about this. So no, it doesn't. I think the problem is that they know that people are betting much more from at home, from the comfort of wherever, despite the fact that horse racing is actually the second most spectated sport in the UK after football. The British Horse Racing Authority has commissioned analysis which says that it will be about a £330 million revenue hit over 5 years, and that places nearly 3,000 jobs at risk. The government line at the moment is that they haven't made any decisions, that basically simpler and unified tax would be cleaner and a better way of like revenue raising. And they highlight, as we were just saying there, Ollie, that people at the horse racing itself don't have, or bookmakers at the horse racing don't have to pay tax. So yes.
Okay. So, I mean, you can understand, Harriet, why people who work in the industry are upset about this. But from the government's perspective, and they've been kite flying all summer, haven't they? Shall we cut this? Shall we cut that? You know, compared to putting taxes on the things that people sort of don't have a choice about necessarily, like where they live, if they bought a house 20 years ago. This is a sort of luxury product, isn't it? Gambling. I mean, you know, you choose to gamble. If you choose to gamble, why not pay more tax? It doesn't seem that controversial.
I think that's ignoring the really interesting reason why online racing bets, the profits, that they pay a lower tax than the tax paid by online casinos and games. With online games and casinos, which pay the 21% tax rate on their profits, there's a guaranteed turnover. There's a guaranteed profit, which means that operators have a guaranteed percentage of the turnover. But the profits from betting are way less certain because it's a game of skill, right? If you bet on horse racing, you can study horse racing, you can study the bloodlines, you can weigh up all the different horses in the race and you make a bet. And if you are clever and if you know what you're talking about, you could make a profit off the bookies. So the lower rate of tax was basically to incentivize making that extra effort from the operators to kind of invest more. And that's the reason that there was this distinction, is that there is a distinction between a game of skill and a game of chance. The thing is that if you do put the taxes up, then the tax take actually goes down, according to some analysts, not up, because you push people towards the black market.
What does that mean? What's the black market in this circumstance? What would that look like?
So basically like online betting on horse racing that is not legal, that is not regulated. And that is what is believed to have happened in the Netherlands when they pushed the taxes up on online betting in this kind of way. It's believed to have pushed a lot of people towards betting on the illicit market, which means that actually there wouldn't be any extra money from this anyway. So that's the argument that that the distinction exists for a very good reason. And also that increasing it to be in line would not actually generate more money for the Treasury.
But the thing is, though, Rebecca, does that ignore the fact that there's only kind of 4 or 5 really big players running a lot of these online casinos anyway? You know, I don't know what the parent groups are of all the different companies, so this might be the same company that I'm talking about now. But, you know, Ladbrokes, William Hill, Paddy Power, those kind of big brand names have associations with casino-style gambling products and with horse betting. So you'd think with a company of that size, they can sort of spread their tax take across their products, can't they, and make up the difference. It's really, you know, who's going to be impoverished as a result of this?
Yeah, the betting companies themselves aren't necessarily going to take a huge hit. That's why, actually, I don't know if you saw this, but what was really interesting is that the strike has been framed as the horse racing industry trying to protect bookmakers' revenue and, by extension, the sport itself. But the Betting and Gaming Council, which represents bookmakers, reacted to the strike with what I would describe as barely concealed fury for a public statement. They said that futile political gestures will only antagonise the government and frustrate punters. They also said that the strike had been called without consultation with bookmakers themselves. And that's because this means so much more for the horse racing industry than it does for the bookies. I mean, we've been talking about how it will affect horse racing, but obviously if the levy is increased on betting on games of skill, that will affect all sports. But for most sports, this will be a relatively modest inconvenience. But horse racing and betting are just intrinsically linked in a way that, say, football betting isn't. There are lots of money, of course, is spent betting on football, especially around the world. But people who don't gamble still watch football. They still buy season tickets and go to games. They still buy merchandise, funding the sport that way. Whereas most horse racing fans, I couldn't find any statistics, but most horse racing fans, I would assume, are also punters. Yeah, whether it's all the time or only occasionally. And so the fear is that if bookies are being taxed more, they will offer worse odds and fewer incentives on horse racing, which will make horse racing less attractive to gamblers. And so the worst case scenario is that both bookies and punters become less interested in horse racing, which harms the sport, not least because gambling contributes so much to horse racing. In the UK, bookmakers contributed £350 million to horse racing per year. In comparison, only 40 million for football. I mean, it's remarkable, the disparity. So horse racing really can't survive if bookmakers lose interest and decide that the effort of paying the additional tax rate and of having to calculate the odds and having to pay 10% of their profits towards this horse racing levy, if they decide that's not worth it anymore, that really is the end of it for horse racing.
Well, except, Jamie, I mean, we were hearing in that clip that you played us, someone who works in a yard saying that she's finding it hard. But I mean, it's all underpinned by billionaires, isn't it? People who own racehorses have a lot of money. They also can pick up the slack. They also are going to do it not whether there's punters or not, but because they like it as a hobby and they like trading horses and owning horses.
I think what was interesting is the rise, particularly in horse racing, the rise in racing that it outwits the British Isles. It's the same arguments that we've had about the Gulf states being involved in other sports, and it's happening with horse racing now. There are bigger and bigger races happening in the Gulf states with Saudi and other backers. So yes, that argument that you put across is potentially how ministers are going to dress it up if it does come to the budget. I think that's a question as to who picks up the bill when it comes to horse racing and how that changes. I also think though that the story is a bit of a snapshot of a broader shift in kind of how we view gambling in the UK. But over the last decade, kind of successive governments have tightened rules around gambling, limits on gambling advertising. We've actually had conversations on this podcast before about sponsorship of football teams and actions for kind of online betting for under 18s. It seems like gambling is being kind of treated less and less as a harmless pastime and more as a kind of public health issue. But obviously that's completely out of step with the racing industry, which is really pushing a kind of skill-based cultural institution. You only have to look at the Grand National and the kind of media around it as like the one time that everyone in the nation puts a bet on, gambling is like this fun thing, to realize that there probably is at some point, maybe this is the beginning of it, are going to be a divide between whether we say, no, gambling is actually a problem and is a public health issue, or is it a bit of fun that anyone can get involved in and actually kind of quite intrinsically British, I guess?
Yeah, and that's fascinating, that question, I think, Harriet, because this concept of harmonising the gambling tax revenues comes from an article that Gordon Brown wrote, former Prime Minister, and a lot of the societal ills that we've been faced with in the last 20 years also have their roots in Gordon Brown in 2001 in his budget, saying we can have fixed odds betting terminals in bookies on the high street. And I wonder, just from a sort of personal perspective, whether this is actually his guilt speaking. He allowed people to behave like they're in a casino when they're on the high street. Working class people lost hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result of that. And this is an attempt to say, oh no, there is a way to make it fair. That was the mistake, wasn't it? It's actually nothing to do with horse racing.
Yeah, the irony, I'm sure, is not lost on anyone, especially because, obviously gambling is a huge problem. The gambling addiction is it's a terrible ill and affects so many people in awful ways. But there is a much higher correlation between addiction and problem gambling and like casino gaming and slots, rather than, as we were talking about, games of skill like betting on horse racing. The correlation is significantly higher. So if there is a problem. It's certainly not the bigger problem in horse betting than it is in online casinos. I also think, and this is kind of weird for me to say as someone sitting here in London, having never been to a stable in my life, and kind of automatically knee-jerk thinking that horse racing is like really terribly cruel and outdated and bizarre, frankly. But it is true that it's really woven into the fabric of so much of the country. Like, in so much of the countryside, the horse racing or training facilities or stables are such an intrinsic part of communities, and they support the racing industry directly or indirectly supports 85,000 jobs in the UK. I don't have a stat to compare that with online gambling, but I think it would be a mistake to lump online gambling and casino and fixed odds betting in with horse racing and the kind of the physical and social infrastructure that is behind it. It's just not the same thing.
Jamie, this does seem like one, if I was a betting man, when the fun stops, that will make it into the budget. You know, this feels like it's got the momentum. Yes, people are upset, but they're probably not the people that the Labour government are too worried about upsetting.
Yeah, and I think that the quote from the Treasury Minister, you know, usually they say something about, you know, we can't say before the budget, you know, we're not going to comment previous to the budget. But this was actually him coming out and trying to mitigate it already by saying, like, look, you already get completely tax-free gambling. So I would agree with you in that sense. I think that probably is going to happen. I wonder, though, longer term, what that says, you know, as Rebecca was pointing out, maybe potentially it wasn't the best idea in terms of a strike. It was very symbolic, and it did seem to kind of, it kind of took my eye to turn off all the racing and everything, but they haven't got any plans for further strikes. This seems to be like a one and done thing. And I think it probably will be something that ends up just kind of slightly fizzling out, that people say like, oh yeah, this was a bad idea. We weren't particularly a big fan of this. But actually it becomes part of the future.
All right. Up next, when it comes to impressing your partner, does size matter? The long and short of that after this. Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are men getting a leg up?
In option number 1, an intramedullary nail is used, which is inserted into the bone, typically in the tibia, and secured with screws at the ends of the nail to prevent movement and stabilize the fracture. The professional then performs a controlled fracture and proceeds to separate the leg bone into 2 parts.
Limb lengthening surgery explained. A video from Habib Studio shared on Saturday. Harriet, what is going on?
This is this is not for the faint-hearted, this one. So the NHS this week has taken the relatively unusual step of urging people, please don't have this leg lengthening surgery. And the reason that they did that is because there's been this enormous wave of interest, and a growing number of particularly young men are getting this procedure to increase their height. And analysts believe that the global limb lengthening industry is going to be worth $8.6 billion by 2030. So this is a huge growing global industry.
Wow. And okay, I mean, just to really hit the nail on the head here, why are the NHS telling people not to do it? It's obviously painful to have your limbs lengthened. Is it unsafe?
It's incredibly risky. So how it works, just a quick little, just brace yourself. So the leg is broken in 2 by driving in a nail into the bone and then pulled apart. So you cut the bone into these 2 segments, and then you attach this kind of thin metal frame to each of the segments with like these pins in between it that create this magnetic field. The nail has this mechanism, the magnetic mechanism. So each day it pulls the 2 segments apart bit by bit over the course of several months. And the body creates new bone to fill the gap. And it can extend the bones, the thigh bone by up to 8 centimetres, or the shin bone by up to 5 centimetres.
I mean, I don't want to say that's good. It's not good because of what you're describing. But that is, if you are worried you're too short, in inverted commas, that's a significant gain, 8 centimetres.
It is, but it's also not guaranteed. So the risks, bones that are separated too quickly won't mend, or they'll grow together with tissue that's too fragile to bear your weight. So your legs can end up being different lengths. You could end up with a permanent disability, infections, nerve damage, blood clots, sometimes fatal conditions. So sometimes the fat that is expelled by the rod can end up in the lung and kill you. Wow. The risk of complications are estimated to be about twice that of a knee replacement. And even if it goes well, you're talking about weeks and weeks and weeks of intense physio and incredible pain and recovery where you're in a wheelchair for most of the time. So this is not something to be taken lightly, and the risks are incredibly high.
Okay, Jamie, I genuinely cannot remember how tall you are. I can't remember if you're a tall man or a short man. What's your height?
6'1".
Okay, so you're a tall man.
Yeah.
Do you think if you were, 5 foot, this would appeal to you?
I would hope not, just from the risks and everything. But I guess it kind of it's part of a kind of trend, right? What Harriet's describing is the kind of the new advances in surgery are kind of the same as the kind of new advances in hair transplant surgery, in teeth. All of these kind of cosmetic things that have basically made it the kind of surgeries like this more marketable.
Yes.
Whereas previously it was something that, people just couldn't even fathom, or if they could, it was too expensive.
But with a hair transplant, you can say, I had hair, then I lost it. I'd like to get it back. I mean, with height, it's like you never had that height. You're not designed to have that height.
And I guess that would be part of the thing, is that, like, how would the people around me react if I suddenly walked in 7 inches taller, than I was like the week before, or even 2 weeks before? That to me is a mad thing. But there's obviously a culture, constantly on social media about the kind of issues with height. And I mean, I'm sure Harriet and Rebecca would be better placed as people who are looking for men, suitors, I would say, at some point in their lives, whether height played a big issue in their choices. But I know from chats with people in my life that, yes, height is an issue. And so I can see that issue then rearing its head, as it were, if you are short. But I would just point out that we've had loads of very successful short people in society. A lot of Rishi Sunak, Vladimir Putin, Nicolas Sarkozy. Yeah. These are all short, quote unquote, short kings, right? So it's not a Napoleon. It's not a, that sounds very patronising to all the short men out there. But it's not a life sentence for.
Well, some people would argue that those guys are kind of overcompensated slightly. Maybe gone the wrong way.
They're a diverse list. But I mean, Rebecca, what Jamie's saying there is this is men's problem, and as Harriet outlines, more men are seeking this procedure, but it's women's fault. It's your fault. You've created the issue by looking for tall men.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to stress this point too heavily, but I think worth bearing in mind that primarily women through decades have subjected themselves to untold misery and physical danger in weight loss treatments. Stuff like fen-phen, you don't have to look too far back into history to find women risking their lives to lose weight, often for similar reasons, to fit a societal expectation and to pursue the idea of making yourself more palatable in the dating world, which is what's going on here. But I mean, the short kings thing, not talking about short kings as in short dictators, we're not talking about the Putins and the Napoleons, but the idea of attractive men as being short kings, I mean, that was always a nonsense, right? It's a social media nonsense. I mean, if you think back to Hot Rodent Summer, do you remember Hot Rodent Summer?
I've literally no idea what you're talking about.
I remember Hot Rodent Summer. It was a great summer for me.
It was a handful. It was basically this very brief attempt to suggest that some heartthrobs in the spotlight, your Jeremy Allen Whites, had ratty faces essentially, but were still attractive. But people, it's very similar to Short Kings. People don't actually like men with ratty faces as a class. It was about the fact that a handful of very attractive men had a slightly rodenty charm about them, and Short Kings is just that. It's about how hot men can be short rather than short men as a group being hot. So, and this is, yes, I'm certainly not going to say women are to blame, but it is obviously tied into the way that dating apps have turned dating into the equivalent of browsing Vinted for a specific lightly soiled Topshop jacket you already have in mind. The idea that you are like, Michelangelo filtering away all of the things you don't want until you have chiseled out the ideal date. The idea of pre-screening all your encounters to fit a physical, a list of criteria has never been the norm before. I mean, obviously there was online dating before there were apps, and obviously there were Lonely Hearts columns, etc. But people were not writing into Lonely Hearts columns with a list of physical requirements. So yeah, this idea that to get in the door of dating you have to pass these filters has changed things.
Yeah, except they were saying, Harriet, tall, dark and handsome. That is a trope that's been going on for centuries. It is those three words every man knows.
Yes, the thing that has changed, there's quite a few things that have changed specifically in the last 10 years. So firstly, there is the rise of social media and influencers. That has all kind of decreased the stigma around cosmetic procedures and around these sorts of things, like particularly influencers talking about hair transplants or cosmetic tweakments, that kind of thing. So growing normalization of that. There has also been a massive increase in demand because the pandemic, which shut down clinics and tourism, created this pent-up demand because people had more time and more visibility, like to kind of scrutinize the way they look and the way they felt and felt terrible about themselves. Then there's the technological advances, so this magnetic nail that's being kind of driven into your leg. Also the fact that orthopedic surgeons are for the first time kind of getting in on the plastic surgery money, so they're competing for customers around the world, marketing themselves on social media and Google search. And then you've got dating apps, which have effectively made it algorithmically unlikely for a short man to find a match. Bumble claims that most of the women that use its app set their lower limit at 6 feet for men. That rules out 85% of men.
Yeah.
So there's all of these things that have come together in the past 10 years to create this perfect storm. And just in June, Tinder launched its height filter in a way that you cannot filter for weight, and you cannot filter for hair type, and you cannot filter for any other kind of physical attribute.
Can you not? I've not used a dating thing. You can't filter for weight. Why not?
I think that would open an enormous can of worms. I mean, can you imagine, considering how much shtick that Tinder got for their height filter? Imagine if they did. Also, I'm sorry, but like, most men don't need a weight filter. They just filter out women they don't think are thin enough anyway. So it's completely irrelevant.
It's not consistent though, is it? I mean, you either should be able to filter for what you want or you shouldn't. I don't understand why you can't filter for exactly what you want if that's what you want.
It was a very controversial decision by Tinder. But I think what's interesting is that according to this YouGov survey, more than half of people, men and women, say that dating apps should allow users to filter by height. It's the same number of men and women, about 56%, believe that dating apps should be allowed to do this. And that goes significantly higher among people that have used dating apps, which I think that's really interesting, that there is clearly a demand for it. But what's sad, I think, is that survey showed that young people, so under 30s, were more likely to say it was unacceptable. So this seems to go against the narrative that younger people are becoming more progressive, more accepting, more less superficial. It's in fact the direct opposite.
I think there's also quite a serious thing about, at the moment, the technology and the medical side of things is risky. And like Harriet was saying and setting out how it can be fatal. But say in 10, 15, 20, 30 years time, it becomes less risky.
Like hair transplants.
Like hair transplants. And in some way, we're able to lengthen and get taller through a safe transplant. It's quite similar to the conversation around Ozempic. What does it do to people who choose not to do that? What does it say about society that we then say to these people, look, here's an opportunity that you could be taller, but you've chosen not to be taller. So what does that say about you? I think there's a real serious issue that this could be a kind of, thin end of the wedge thing, where if we accept this as actually, yes, there's a kind of idealized idea of the type of person that we are, and you only have to pay a certain amount of money and you get to be that person, we're in really sticky water as a society.
Yeah, and I think it's worth focusing on the fact as well that this is not new technology. This basic technique has been around since the 1950s. It was invented by a Soviet doctor called Gavril Elizarov, who built the first Elizarov apparatus using bike parts. But he built it for clinical use to heal complex fractures that couldn't be healed through conventional means. It got its first high-profile success in 1968 when he used it on an Olympic high jumper who'd broken his shin bone and ankle in a motorcycling accident. And he'd had 20 unsuccessful surgeries before he was finally able to access this apparatus that reset his bones. And I think, it is a clinical device. And until very recently, the idea that a healthy person who had not been in a horrific accident would choose to use it voluntarily for cosmetic purposes, like somebody who sought that out would be seen as having a mental illness. And frankly, I think when you strip away all of the, the social madness behind this. I think, that's probably still the way we should see this. It's deeply, deeply unhealthy to voluntarily break your own bones. I mean, that's what's at the heart of it, right?
Yes, but is that different, Harriet, to getting a nose job or getting a boob job or getting a penis extension, all these things we've lived with for 50 years?
It's really difficult to say. I think what's unusual about this is that most of the procedures that we talk about, and we've spoken about on the podcast before, one of the riskiest is the Brazilian butt lift, the BBL, which is incredibly risky and one of the fastest growing cosmetic procedures, and boob jobs and everything from Botox and fillers and laser treatments that burn your face off right through to major surgery like this. It is all on the rise. It is all, and it's been turbocharged by social media and, like I said, the demand created by the pandemic. But what's unusual about this leg lengthening surgery is that it is young men. Like most of the cosmetic procedures and most of these incredibly invasive and frankly some of them horrific procedures are done by young women, thanks to the pressure that is put on women by society to look a certain way. But a recent study that came out in June showed that for the first time ever, young men in the UK now outspend women on tweakments like Botox, which is why people are starting to call it Brotox. So 23% of men between 18 and 34 had Botox or fillers or dental veneers. That was more than women in the same age group for the first time. So what I think that I want to use the story to highlight is not that it's necessarily anything different from all the horrific and risky procedures that women put themselves through, but that for the first time, young men are really starting to be put in the same position. It is the thin edge of the wedge. Like, you will get to a point in society where if you have a certain amount of money, and it is very expensive, it can be £50,000 in the UK, up to 240,000, but you can get it a lot cheaper in Turkey. But if all of these procedures become normalized, then you become the outlier if you don't get them. And the danger is that we start to normalize people paying a fortune to have their leg bones broken, or paying a fortune to have fat injected into their bums, or paying a fortune to have bits of them cut off or bits of them broken and risking sepsis and death. I think that broader picture of anxiety and pressure around the way that people look is a very dark one.
Well, I can say if you're 6'2.5", you have to endure quite a lot of discomfort when you go to a fun fair, so just bear that in mind. My thanks to Jamie, Harriet and Rebecca for their contributions to this week's show. Remember, you can follow this show for free regardless of your height. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can watch us as well. And you can get 6 free issues of The Week magazine if you take out a trial subscription at theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart, who's less than 6 foot at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.